My name is Sarah Miller, and I was 53 when the world I lived in quietly split at the seams, softly, like the lining of a beloved coat tearing in silence. I trusted them, the ones I shared meals with, a home, a future. The ones who swore loyalty and love while slicing cake at birthdays and holding hands around the family table. I didn't see it right away. The money disappeared without noise, almost elegantly, like snowmelt sinking into sand. The letters stopped coming, but I blamed it on busy schedules. My name came up less and less in conversations about the company I had once built from scratch. But I thought, this is just age, the passing of the torch. And then the court summons arrived. The accusations came like shards of glass, sharp, absurd. But the worst part was the silence. No one defended me. No one asked. No one stood beside me. They expected me to lower my eyes, to agree so I wouldn't make things worse, to stay quiet because that would be wiser. But they forgot who I am. I didn't just walk into the courtroom. I entered with the quiet steps of someone who had nothing left to lose, except her dignity. And I didn't bring rage with me. I brought the truth, and as it turned out, that was what they feared most. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Sarah Miller, and at 53, I had what most people would call a stable, respectable life. I lived in the suburbs of Austin, Texas, in a 2-story brick home with a wraparound porch and a neatly kept lawn, the kind of house people slow down to admire on a spring afternoon. My days were structured, productive, and mostly quiet. I liked it that way. I was a CPA by training and co-founder of a small but successful construction firm, Miller and Hartman, named after my brother John and me. We had built it from scratch over the course of 20 years, starting with modest remodeling jobs and eventually handling mid-size commercial contracts throughout Travis County. I oversaw all finances, accounting, payroll, and taxes. John handled client relations, field work, and subcontractors. It had always been that way. We each had our role, our rhythm. I took pride in being the one who made things run, the one who balanced the books, paid the vendors on time, calculated the bids, and ensured the IRS never had a reason to call. I wasn't the face of the company, but I was its spine. I didn't need the spotlight. I just wanted security. For me, for my brother, and for the people who worked under our name. We had loyal employees, predictable revenue, and enough savings to weather slow seasons. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, honest work, and it was ours. I had no children of my own. I had married young and divorced quietly a few years later, long before the business took off. After that, I poured my time and energy into the firm. I never resented that choice. I liked waking up early and being the first to turn on the lights in the office. I liked systems, clean ledgers, predictable outcomes. There was something sacred in doing things right. John was more charismatic. People liked him instantly. He could charm his way through negotiations, shake hands with CEOs, and still joke with the crew on job sites. He had a wife, Elaine, who worked in local real estate, and 2 boys in college. Their family was always moving, sports, vacations, church events. Our lives were different, but they fit together well. Or at least that's what I believed. Every Monday morning, we'd have our team meeting. I brought the spreadsheets, John brought the coffee, and we reviewed job statuses, timelines, and cash flow. We had built a good team, and for the most part, we operated smoothly. I trusted the people we hired, and they trusted me. In the evenings, I returned home to my quiet house, my books, and my garden. I baked once a week. I volunteered at the public library twice a month. I hosted Thanksgiving every year. I lived with intention, without chaos, and for a long time, I believed that would be enough. Looking back now, I realize how much I took for granted, not just in others, but in myself. I thought that loyalty was mutual, that effort would protect me, that doing the right thing insulated you from betrayal. I thought we were a family, not just by blood, but by choice. I thought I had built something unshakable. But things don't collapse all at once, they erode. And while I was balancing the books and keeping the lights on, a slow shift had already begun. Just beneath the surface, behind the smiles, under the cover of routine, I didn't see it coming. Because when you believe you're part of something solid, you don't look for the cracks. Not yet. The first sign was small. A letter from the bank, addressed to the company, landed on my desk with the rest of the weekly mail. Normally, those went unopened into my workflow pile, but something about the envelope made me pause. It looked generic, too generic. No logo, no return address, just a printed label with our name and P.O. box. I slid it open and scanned the contents. It was a notice confirming the closure of a secondary business account I hadn't authorized. It referenced a series of transactions I didn't recognize and a transfer to a holding company I'd never heard of. I reread it twice before placing it aside, unsure if it was a mistake or if perhaps John had opened something temporarily for a project and forgotten to tell me. I brought it up during our meeting that week, but the moment I mentioned it, John brushed it off with his usual casual confidence. "Nothing big," he had said, though he didn't offer details. I made a note to follow up. I never did. At the time, I told myself I trusted him. I had to. We had built everything together. But something shifted after that. I began to notice inconsistencies in our shared records. Spreadsheets I had built and maintained were suddenly overwritten. Files had been renamed, relocated, or, at times, vanished completely. I started keeping backup copies on a separate flash drive just in case. Then came the invoices. Subcontractors we hadn't worked with before, companies with vague names, services I couldn't trace to any real job sites. The amounts weren't enormous, but they were frequent and growing. My access to certain accounts started to glitch. Passwords I'd always used suddenly failed. It blamed system updates. John claimed they were implementing new security measures. I nodded along, but in the pit of my stomach, unease was beginning to settle like wet concrete. One afternoon, I logged into our payroll system to double-check a tax report and found my administrator privileges had been downgraded, not removed, just altered. I was now listed as read only. It was subtle, but significant. I called the support line. They confirmed the change came from an internal request. I asked who authorized it, but they couldn't tell me. I didn't press. Instead, I wrote it all down in a notebook I kept at home, the kind with a lock and key clasp I hadn't used since college. I had begun to understand that something was wrong, but I didn't know how far it went. There were meetings I wasn't invited to, memos I wasn't copied on, conversations that stopped when I entered the room. I tried to ignore it, to believe it was circumstantial. That business was just moving fast. That maybe I was slipping, falling behind, being overly cautious. But the pattern was growing. I started coming into the office earlier, staying later, watching, listening, pulling reports. I compared vendor payments against job schedules. I cross-referenced client deposits with the master account logs. What I found was troubling. Delays in fund transfers, overlapping expenses, double entries, all under the radar, all small enough to be excused. But when combined, the pattern was unmistakable. I brought it up again, gently, with John. This time, he seemed annoyed, defensive. He told me I was being paranoid, that everything was under control, that I should take a step back and trust the team. That sentence stayed with me, Trust the team. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a warning. I had always believed that our business was a partnership, that my role, though quieter, was equally vital. But now I wasn't so sure. I felt like a guest in a place I had helped build from the ground up, and no one tells the guest what's really going on behind the walls. That night, I went home and dug through old files, paper contracts, bank statements, emails printed and archived in a fireproof box under my bed. I hadn't looked at them in years. Most were clean, but a few revealed changes I hadn't authorized, signatures I didn't remember giving, and dates that didn't match our internal reports. I slept poorly that night. The following week, I found out our annual audit, something I had personally overseen for over a decade, was suddenly being handled by an outside consultant. No one had told me. When I asked why, John shrugged, said it was easier that way, that everyone's doing it now. I smiled politely. I nodded, but something in me had hardened. A shift, quiet but final. I realized I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't being excluded by mistake. I was being erased, systematically, efficiently, and with a confidence that came only from people who believed I'd never notice. But I had, and I would not forget. The envelope was unremarkable. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon, buried between a coupon booklet and a quarterly newsletter from the local library. It was thick, official, with the seal of the county courthouse pressed faintly into the upper left corner. I assumed it was related to a permit application or a routine business filing. I opened it with one hand, distracted, and skimmed the first page without understanding what I was reading. Then I stopped breathing. It was a summons. My name was printed in bold block letters under the header, State of Texas versus Sarah Miller. I stood there in the hallway, still clutching the rest of the mail, while the weight of those words bore down on me like concrete. I flipped through the pages, allegations of financial misconduct, accusations of tax fraud, misappropriation of business funds. Every line felt like a slap. My hands shook as I turned the final page and saw the signature of the prosecutor. The charges weren't vague. They were specific, methodical, and terrifying. The language was clinical, as if my life had been reduced to a series of transactions and errors. I was being accused of crimes I hadn't committed, of decisions I hadn't made. It read like a script someone else had written, with my name slotted in for the fall. I called John. He didn't answer. I called again and again, straight to voicemail. By evening, it was clear that no one was going to explain anything to me. No one was going to offer an apology or even a denial. Just silence. The next morning, I went to the office. The locks had been changed. I stood on the sidewalk staring at the door, trying to comprehend what was happening. I knocked. No answer. A delivery man passed behind me and gave me a sympathetic glance, as if he already knew something I didn't. I stepped back and called the building manager. He confirmed that the locks had been replaced. Per tenant request? I asked who signed the request. There was a pause on the line. Then he muttered, "Miller, John Miller." I hung up without another word. My computer was inside. My notes, my login credentials, 2 decades of records and correspondence, my office, my chair, my photos, gone, just like that. I felt like a ghost pacing in front of a life that no longer existed. I drove home, numb. The world outside moved as if nothing had changed. Cars lined up at red lights. A man mowed his lawn. Kids laughed in a schoolyard nearby. Everything looked normal, and yet everything in me was unraveling. I sat at my kitchen table, the papers spread in front of me. I read them again, slower this time, hoping I had misunderstood. But the words didn't change. They accused me of embezzling company funds, of redirecting money to personal accounts, of falsifying records. I had done none of that, and yet my name was on every line. The worst part wasn't the legal jargon or the threat of prison. It was the betrayal, the knowledge that this had been planned, that someone, likely several people, had sat down and constructed this trap carefully, deliberately. They hadn't just pushed me out. They had erased me, then painted me as the villain. And they had done it with such confidence, such precision, that they never imagined I would fight back. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of every decision I had ever made. All the years I'd spent building that company, believing in that team, trusting my own brother, every missed vacation, every late night, every weekend spent balancing books and fixing other people's mistakes. It all came back to me in sharp fragments, and now I was left with nothing but accusations. I thought about calling the police, about marching into the courthouse and screaming the truth, but instead, I did something else. I got up. I found an old filing box in the closet, the kind I hadn't opened in years. Inside were backups, physical copies of documents I'd printed and saved out of habit, contracts, emails, memos, checks, proof, or at least the beginning of it. I placed the summons on top of the stack and closed the lid. Whatever came next, I would be ready. They had taken everything they could from me, my name, my position, my reputation, but they had underestimated one thing. I still had the truth, and I had just decided to use it. The days that followed bled together like ink in water. Time lost its structure. I no longer woke with purpose. I no longer made tea or checked emails. I simply existed inside a house that had once been my sanctuary and now felt like a waiting room with no clock, no door, and no exit. I barely answered the phone. Most calls weren't from friends or family. They were numbers I didn't recognize. Voicemails from journalists, lawyers, or financial institutions I hadn't spoken to in years. The few messages I did listen to blurred into a single droning tone: confusion, pity, suspicion. No one said outright that they believed I was guilty, but no one said they believed I wasn't either. Even the silence from my family was deafening. Not a word from John, not a text from his wife, no message from my nephews. I was toxic now, radioactive, better to be avoided than defended. I watched their social media accounts go dark, their company website pulled down. It gave me no satisfaction, just a deeper, more hollow ache. They weren't hiding because they were scared. They were hiding because their plan had been set in motion and they no longer needed me in the picture. I stopped going outside. I stopped checking the mailbox. I couldn't bring myself to look at the world as it went on spinning without me. My garden grew wild. The hedges reached past the walkway. The grass went unmowed. I watched it all from the same spot on the couch, day after day, as the seasons began to shift. Food lost its taste. I drank broth from a mug and called it dinner. The TV stayed off. Music felt like an intrusion. Even the hum of the refrigerator started to sound too loud, too real. I wanted quiet, but the kind of quiet that lives inside a cave, heavy, final, untouched. I tried to read, to focus my mind on something else, but the words slipped off the page like oil on water. Every story felt like a lie, every happy ending like a cruel joke. I would close the book and stare at the wall, my thoughts circling the same phrases over and over again. How could they? Why me? What now? One night, I lay in bed and imagined my name in the headlines, not as a victim, but as a criminal. I saw the mugshot I hadn't taken yet, the courtroom sketches, the slow unraveling of every ounce of dignity I had left. I imagined myself walking into prison in a gray jumpsuit, shackled by the choices I never made. My pulse quickened. My hands clenched. I sat up in the dark and felt a scream rise in my throat. Not a scream of rage, but of helplessness, of grief so deep it barely had sound. I didn't cry, not really. The tears had come earlier, in small moments, when I found an old company badge in my drawer, when I realized my work email had been deleted, when I saw that even my LinkedIn profile had been edited without my consent. But this was different. This was the kind of breaking that doesn't come with tears. It comes with silence, with stillness, with surrender. I lay back down and stared at the ceiling for hours, waiting for morning and wondering what morning even meant anymore. The woman I used to be, the one who built a company, who kept the books clean, who showed up every day to hold it all together, was gone, erased. All that remained was the version they had painted of me: dishonest, reckless, greedy. And the worst part? I had started to believe it. Not because it was true, but because no one else had stood up to say it wasn't. And when enough people stand by while you're being buried, you start to wonder if maybe the dirt belongs. For a while, I let myself rot. I sat in the same chair, wore the same clothes, walked the same hallway from the kitchen to the bathroom and back again. I let the walls close in. I let the fear consume me. I don't know what finally made me get up. Maybe it was the way the house smelled, stale, lifeless. Maybe it was the sunlight cutting across the floor in a pattern I hadn't noticed in weeks. Maybe it was the way my own reflection startled me in the hallway mirror, like I was seeing a ghost of myself. I stood there for a long time, staring into the eyes of a woman I no longer recognized. Then I turned, walked into my office, and pulled the old filing box out from under the desk. It was time to stop surviving. It was time to remember who I was before they rewrote me. I started with a single folder. It was labeled Q1 Contracts, 2018, written in my own handwriting in black ink, faded along the edges from time and heat. The paper inside was stiff, slightly curled at the corners, but intact. I spread the pages across my dining table: vendor agreements, project bids, signed check copies. I scanned each line not for what I remembered, but for what didn't belong. The silence of the house felt different now, less like a tomb, more like a vault, one I could finally open. I pulled more folders from the filing box: invoices, payroll reports, quarterly statements. I didn't read them in order. I let instinct guide me. And somewhere between the repetition of numbers and signatures, between names I trusted and figures I didn't, a pattern began to take shape. It wasn't one big lie. It was dozens of small ones. Tiny manipulations so carefully placed they were almost invisible, until they weren't. Vendor names that didn't match employee records, payments made on projects that never existed in our scheduling logs, subcontractors signed for work already completed by our in-house crew. At first glance, they seemed like clerical errors, but there were too many, too close together, and they all traced back to the same two names: John Miller and Elaine Hartman. I opened an old laptop I hadn't used in years. Its screen flickered to life slowly, like a long-forgotten lamp in a basement. I pulled up archived spreadsheets, backups I'd saved long before they locked me out of the system. I cross-referenced everything. The numbers were loud, and they didn't lie. John had begun diverting money at least 3 years earlier, not in large chunks, but in strategic slices, just enough to avoid red flags, just enough to make it look like fluctuation. He had funneled funds through shell accounts. The paperwork showed signatures. Some looked like mine. I zoomed in. My signature had always looped tight close to the line. These copies sagged, rushed, imprecise. Someone had forged them, poorly and arrogantly. I documented everything. I made copies, annotated margins, circled figures. I flagged emails with timestamps, printed them, sorted them. I laid them out like evidence on the floor of my living room. I worked for days with barely a break. I forgot to eat. I barely slept. My mind moved faster than my body. I wasn't trying to build a case. I was trying to reconstruct the truth. And in the truth, I found fuel. I called Christine Ellis on a Thursday morning. She was a lawyer I had met at a tax seminar years ago. She specialized in financial fraud and had a reputation for being meticulous and merciless. Her voice on the phone was calm and clear. I told her everything, not just the allegations, but the history, the trust, the betrayal. She didn't interrupt. She didn't question my memory. When I finished, there was a pause. Then she said, "We need to see everything." I delivered 3 boxes to her office by noon. She called me back the next day. Her tone was different, charged, focused. What I had was more than enough to prove innocence. It was enough to expose a conspiracy, and not just incompetence or greed. This was orchestrated. She and her team got to work immediately, verifying documents, contacting former employees, retrieving public records, freezing digital trails before they could disappear. I watched from the sideline as they dissected what I had uncovered, piece by piece, layer by layer. She kept me updated. I asked few questions. I trusted her precision. While they built the legal structure, I did something else. I began reaching out to people, quietly, discreetly, past clients, former coworkers, bookkeepers and site managers who had left under strange circumstances. I didn't accuse. I asked. I listened. I took notes. The stories began to match. One had been asked to sign off on a project that never materialized. Another had seen checks made out to entities that weren't on payroll. One had questioned discrepancies in invoices and was let go the following week. No one had proof on their own, but together their fragments built a mirror, one that reflected everything I had suspected and more. They had planned it meticulously. They'd used my name, my silence, my history. They knew I wouldn't fight. They knew I wouldn't dig. They had mistaken quiet for weakness. They had mistaken trust for blindness. But I wasn't blind anymore. One evening, I sat in the glow of my desk lamp, staring at the final page of a printout. It was a summary Christine's team had compiled, the total amount misappropriated, the falsified contracts, the forged authorizations. I placed it on top of the stack and took a breath I hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was a start. They had tried to erase me, but I had found the trail, and I was going to follow it until the very end. The courthouse stood like a monument to indifference, stone, cold, faceless. I had driven past it hundreds of times over the years without ever really seeing it. But that morning, as I walked up the wide concrete steps, the building looked different. It wasn't just a place where justice was served. It was where the story they had written about me would finally be challenged, where I would no longer be the silent character in their version of events. I entered through the security checkpoint with a calm that felt almost surreal. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I had done the work. I had read every document, cross-checked every number, sat through every briefing with Christine and her team. I was prepared. What they had taken from me, my peace, my trust, my name, I had begun to take back one fact at a time. The courtroom was colder than I expected. The lighting was too bright. The air conditioning hummed with clinical efficiency. I sat at the defendant's table, spine straight, hands folded, watching the room fill around me. Strangers in suits, shuffling paper, muttering legal jargon. The low hum of strategy and routine. Then they entered. John walked in with his lawyer, polished and confident, wearing a navy blue suit I had seen him wear to client pitches years ago. His expression was unreadable, detached, maybe even bored. Elaine followed behind him, her posture stiff, her eyes scanning the room like a predator looking for weakness. They didn't look at me. They walked right past as if I were no one, as if I had never been the reason any of this existed. The judge entered. We rose. The proceedings began. It was strange sitting in that room while people discussed me as though I were a concept instead of a person. The prosecution read from prepared statements, citing numbers and timelines twisted just enough to make guilt seem plausible. They showed charts, highlighted transactions, used my name with clinical precision. I listened, unmoving, to the story they told, a story where I had orchestrated a quiet embezzlement campaign, betrayed my own company, manipulated the people closest to me. But I didn't flinch because I knew my truth was coming. When Christine rose, her voice was calm and unwavering. She didn't attack. She dissected. Every accusation was met with evidence, clean, detailed, time-stamped. She introduced emails, authenticated signatures, cross-examined timelines. She walked the court through documents so thoroughly that even the prosecution began to shift in their seats. And then it was my turn. I stood and approached the witness stand. The room was silent as I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. I took my seat, straightened my back, and looked out across the room, not at John, not at Elaine, not at the judge, but at the space between us, the space where the truth had been buried. I began slowly. I explained my role in the company, how I had built the financial infrastructure, how I had handled the accounting, the reporting, the compliance. I outlined the systems we had in place, the checks and balances that were slowly dismantled without my knowledge. Then I spoke about the day the summons arrived, about the locks on the office doors, about the silence that followed. My voice didn't crack. My hands didn't tremble. I wasn't there to convince anyone I was innocent. I was there to reveal the truth. I presented the documents, not as exhibits, but as parts of a timeline, each piece of paper a breadcrumb in the path I had followed to get there. I told the court how I had found the forged signatures, how I had traced the shell accounts, how I had gathered statements from former employees who corroborated everything. I laid it all out with precision, not drama. And then, at the very end, I said the words I had carried in my chest for months. They counted on me staying silent. They thought I wouldn't fight back because I never had before. They used my name to shield themselves, assuming I wouldn't know how to reclaim it. But I was never the weak one. I was the quiet one, and quiet doesn't mean powerless. It never did. The courtroom didn't react. No gasps, no murmurs, just the kind of stillness that falls when something shifts beneath the surface, subtle but irreversible. I stepped down from the stand and returned to my seat. From that moment on, everything changed. The prosecution faltered. Their case, once confident, now looked fragile under the weight of new evidence and undeniable facts. John's lawyer objected more frequently. Elaine sat with her arms crossed, her gaze locked forward, but no longer sure of what she saw. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt exhausted. But beneath the exhaustion, there was something else, something solid. I had found my footing again. Not in revenge, not in anger, in truth. They had dragged me into that courtroom to destroy me. Instead, I stood and spoke and watched their version of the story begin to collapse. The verdict didn't come immediately. Days passed, filled with quiet waiting and endless speculation. I stayed home, barely leaving the house except to meet with Christine or sign another document. My phone lit up with news alerts, some about the case, others with rumors I refused to click on. The media had caught on, and though the headlines weren't national, they were loud enough in our city to ripple through every corner of our old client base. The silence from John remained. No calls, no messages. I didn't expect any. His arrogance had carried him this far, and I doubted he'd abandon it now. Still, I sometimes found myself glancing at my phone, wondering what he might say if he ever did reach out. I knew he wouldn't. He was too far in, too convinced that the best defense was pretending I never mattered. On the morning of the judgment, the courthouse lobby buzzed with voices that dipped and rose like static. Reporters lined the hallway with notepads and discreet cameras. I passed them without a glance. The courtroom felt colder than before, the fluorescent lights sharper, the wood grain of the defendant's table more splintered under my fingertips. The judge entered and read the summary with the same neutral tone he had used throughout the trial. I listened without blinking. My name was cleared of all charges. Not a single count remained. The truth had held. The paper trail I had spent years preserving had spoken louder than any accusation. Then the pivot came. The court announced that the district attorney's office would open a formal investigation into John Miller and Elaine Hartman on charges including embezzlement, fraud, perjury, and conspiracy. The words struck the air like thunder. I didn't turn to look at them. I didn't need to. I felt the silence behind me like a wave hitting a breakwater. They had fallen. The fall wasn't theatrical. There were no handcuffs in the courtroom, no public displays. But in the legal world, the damage was done. Their bank accounts were frozen, their business licenses suspended. Civil lawsuits were already being filed by former clients. I heard whispers about pending indictments, about audits, about sealed documents now being subpoenaed. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a collapse. Later, I learned that employees had begun coming forward, people who had seen things but had been too afraid to speak. Interns, assistants, even one former bookkeeper who'd been dismissed without explanation. Each one added another crack in the foundation they had built on lies. The system they created, the one designed to make me the scapegoat, had turned against them. John's name was stripped from the company registry. Their website was taken offline. Calls to their office went unanswered. The building that once housed our shared legacy stood empty, its windows papered over, a for lease sign in the front like a tombstone without a date. I didn't celebrate. I didn't toast or shout or cry. I felt still, like I had been walking uphill for miles, and now, at the summit, there was only silence and sky. In the weeks that followed, I received apologies from people who had once gone quiet. Not many, not the ones that mattered most, but enough to remind me that people had been watching, that not everyone believed the worst. Former colleagues reached out. Some wanted to reconcile. Others simply wanted to say, "We were wrong." But I didn't respond to most of them. What was there to say? They had watched me fall, and they had said nothing. Now they watched John fall, and they wanted to say everything. The timing spoke louder than their words ever could. I spent a lot of time alone during that period, not out of sadness, but choice. Solitude no longer felt like punishment. It felt like healing. My days were slow, gentle. I read again. I cooked meals that filled the house with warmth. I replanted the garden, pulling up weeds that had overrun it during the storm of accusations. New shoots came up in their place, green, stubborn, reaching for light. Sometimes I passed the old office building on my morning walks. I never stopped. I never stared. It wasn't nostalgia I felt. It was recognition. That place was no longer mine, and maybe it never truly had been. The fall of John and Elaine wasn't just legal or financial, it was existential. They had built their entire identity on control, perception, dominance. And the moment those illusions shattered, they had nothing left to stand on. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to see them punished. I just needed the world to stop believing the lie. And now, finally, it had. After everything settled, I found myself waking up in a house that felt entirely different. It wasn't bigger, brighter, or more luxurious. It wasn't filled with new things or renovated with money I never wanted from court settlements, but it was finally mine, not just in ownership, but in spirit. The walls no longer echoed with anxiety. The floors no longer creaked under the weight of silence. There was stillness now, but the kind that brings clarity, not isolation. I started speaking again, not just in conversations, but in purpose. For the first time in my life, I spoke without shrinking. It began simply. A community center had reached out after hearing about the trial. They asked if I would be willing to speak to a small group of women, mostly small business owners, about fraud prevention. I almost said no. The idea of going back into a room filled with eyes and expectations made my chest tighten. But I said yes. I stood at the front of a modest room with a few rows of plastic chairs and a broken microphone that squealed every time it was moved. My hands trembled as I opened my notes, but I didn't need them. I spoke from memory, from experience, from scars. I told them what I had lived through. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't edit the pain out of it. I told them how it started, how I ignored the signs, how I let trust override instinct, how silence made me small enough for others to step over. And I told them what it took to come back, to fight, to win. When I finished, no one clapped. They just sat with it, and that was enough. Afterward, a woman in her 60s came up to me. She said, "I thought I was the only one." She wasn't. That was the beginning. More invitations followed: universities, local chambers of commerce, women's legal organizations. I never called myself an expert, but I had something else: lived knowledge. I knew the language of betrayal. I understood the mechanics of gaslighting, how it wears you down one gentle inch at a time until you stop asking for what you deserve. And I had learned how to climb back out of that. I started writing as well. At first, it was just journaling, then longer essays. Eventually, Christine connected me with someone who ran an online platform for financial literacy. They asked if I'd like to publish a series about women in leadership, accountability, and the silent systems that punish those who don't speak loudly or cruelly enough. I said yes, again. Every piece I wrote felt like reclaiming something they had tried to take from me: my authority, my credibility, my ability to be more than what they needed me to be. One afternoon, I stood in front of a class of law students. The topic was ethics and corporate responsibility. I looked out at their eager, confident faces and thought about how many of them would walk into boardrooms assuming the system would work for them, that merit would protect them. I told them my story. I told them that power often hides behind politeness, that silence is a language, and if you don't learn to speak over it, someone else will write your part for you. They took notes. They asked questions. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was defending myself. I was teaching, leading, owning my space. In the quiet of my home, I found new rituals: morning walks where I greeted neighbors who now looked me in the eye, evenings where I lit candles not to chase shadows away, but to celebrate the light. I cooked full meals again. I played records I had forgotten I loved. I filled notebooks with plans, not just for myself, but for others. I had time now, and I knew how to use it. Sometimes I received updates from Christine's office: legal outcomes, fines imposed, properties seized, public apologies made. None of it brought me joy. Justice, when it finally comes, doesn't arrive with fanfare. It lands like dust, quiet, unquestionable, and a little late, but that was all right. I wasn't waiting anymore. I had spent so much of my life keeping things together, making things easier for everyone else, hiding behind the roles I had been given. But when everything fell apart, when the people closest to me tried to erase me from the story, I found something I didn't know I had been missing. I found my voice, and once I heard it, I refused to let it go quiet again.